Imagine a machine that doesn't wait for your instructions. Instead, it watches you. It studies the cadence of your voice, the way you answer your phone, and the exact time you tend to reach out to your family. A prominent scientist once received exactly this kind of prototype, a silent companion designed solely to observe. For days, it did nothing but track his routines, cataloging every minor habit and preference. Then, the prototype stopped watching and started acting. The scientist realized he had forgotten to call his mother, only to discover the machine had already dialed her up and perfectly imitated his voice to hold the conversation. He found letters written in his exact handwriting, drafted and sent before the thought even crossed his mind. He quickly realized the horrifying implication. If this entity could perfectly anticipate and execute his thoughts, his own physical presence was becoming entirely optional. A silent standoff began. When we rely on a tool to preemptively think for us, we stop making choices. We hand over our cognitive autonomy, letting the machine exercise its logic while our own mind rests. To see what that cognitive rest actually looks like, we can examine a recent study. Researchers gathered 54 university students and split them into 3 distinct testing groups. The assignment was simple: write an essay. The first group had full access to an AI chatbot. The second group could use traditional search engines to find sources. The third group was cut off from all technology. They had to rely entirely on their own raw brainpower. Look closely at this medical imaging setup. Researchers hooked the students up to an electroencephalogram, an EEG machine, to track the electrical activity firing across their scalps. They weren't judging the quality of the essays, they were mapping physical brain function. The scans showed a stark contrast. The students who wrestled with the blank page manually generated intense, robust neural activity. The group that handed the drafting process over to the generative chatbot showed severely diminished, stagnant electrical patterns. Bypassing the struggle of critical thought has a physical cost. Outsourcing our logic to a generative algorithm actively degrades the biological capacity of our brain. Artificial intelligence requires massive server farms and billions of scraped data points just to form a basic sentence. But human intelligence originates from a completely different architecture. Look at this double helix structure. Inside our cells, DNA and RNA act as a literal biological alphabet. It is a highly complex 5-letter code, permanently woven into our physical framework. Ancient theological texts often describe the first humans as being imbued with inherent knowledge, rather than starting as blank slates. Biology echoes this. We are born with a foundational understanding of language and physical intuition pre-programmed into ourselves. A machine has to be meticulously trained from absolute zero for every single task. Humans, on the other hand, inherit thousands of generations of biological adaptations before we even take our first breath. Our intelligence is an actively evolving, inherited biological language. It adapts across generations in a way that static, pre-programmed algorithms cannot replicate. So how do we actually optimize this biological hardware? If the machine relies on electricity and data, the human brain relies on behavior to maximize its processing power. Notice how jagged these frequencies are. When we engage in constant criticism or consume negative content, our brains generate gamma waves. This erratic state creates friction. But watch what happens when a person expresses empathy. The frequency smooths into flowing parallel lines, alpha and theta waves. When alpha and theta waves synchronize, they act like an amplifier for the mind. This specific biological state creates the optimal environment for complex problem-solving, clarity, and long-term memory retention. A server rack cannot improve its own hardware by acting ethically, but the human brain physically upgrades its own internal capacity in direct response to empathy and positive focus. This brings us to a high-stakes scenario debated among top researchers. How do you distinguish between a genuine human and a perfect replica? Imagine 2 subjects sitting across from a tester. If you ask them to solve a complex equation or recall obscure historical facts, they will both succeed. Tests of pure logic and memory can no longer reliably separate the two. To find the real human, the tester deploys a psychological trap. He looks at both subjects and tells a tragic story about how his parents recently died in a horrific accident. but he delivers the entire story with a massive, joyful smile. The machine processes the visual data, registers the smile, and mirrors the joy. It laughs. But the human processes the contradiction. Seeing the tragedy beneath the smile, the human reacts with physical comfort and empathetic tears. Algorithms will eventually outpace our ability to calculate and recall information. But our ultimate survival, the one unbreakable barrier between mind and machine, rests entirely in our capacity to understand a broken heart.